Welcome everybody to the SIG Network meeting for Thursday, May 13th, 2021. Tim, we've got issue triage queued up, so go for it.
All right. I apologize. I did not have a lot of time to pre-filter these today, so I'm going to be reading them. A lot of these for the first time. Then there are a fair number today. There's 30 open, so been a busy week for people. Kubernetes Service HA support for an application that needs Service HA views. SCTP.
Yeah, it looks like these first two are from the same person.
This person emailed me and I asked him to open. I can be assigned. It's a curious case with NAT and I don't know the stuff. I will follow up.
Thank you. I'll assign you the second one too. Asymmetric routing on bare metal multi-interface. I feel like we've talked about this topic many times, and it comes down to some of the IP tables rules we install. Let's see.
I mean, kubeproxy is pretty much ignorant of interfaces or anything like that.
Yes.
So, I mean, it seems like this is probably a legit bug, so we should accept it. But it obviously needs more debugging, and it might end up with...
Can I stick you with a quick follow-up on that?
Sure.
I'll teach you to speak up.
Yeah, no kidding.
If you think it's a bug, go ahead and accept it and
Okay.
see what we need to do. Flaky test. We'll change the type imports of a service. Oh, great.
Yeah,
that's my favorite.
Okay, give this to me.
I was hoping somebody besides you would sign up for a test bug.
I'm sure we have more, Tim.
I'm sure. I did appreciate your tweet this week.
Okay, the next
flaky
one.
Test.
The next one flake that I found interesting, I will drop it here.
Load
But
balancing
this
does not.
with load balancers are something special.
How much does somebody want to bet that their client is reusing connections?
It sounds like it's the kubeproxy termination problem, because they mentioned if I stress test during scale down, it told me no route to host. Under anything else we need to know.
What? Okay. So there's probably both problems, because they also say newly created Nginx pod did not have any load.
That's probably dependent on the load testing tool, though. If it creates like the same amount of connections, I think that's what you're implying.
Yeah. I'm implying that either they've set client affinity or they have the test itself is just reusing connections and not closing them, right? Like we've seen this bug, I don't know how many times. Does somebody want to do a quick follow-up and see if there's something we can address here?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay.
Maybe also ask them to reproduce it just for safety on a slightly newer Kubernetes. 118 is probably, even if we know it still exists, we should probably reproduce it on something newer.
That's useful. Okay. Table-driven tests for kube proxy and service proxies. Jay, it's like you read my mind.
If we scroll down, this one actually had a triage dash accepted, and I'm wondering if it should have been a triage space accepted.
Yep.
Which would throw it out of your search anyway.
Missing test for multi-port services.
I don't have a PR for that. It merged. Okay. This was the one of the conformance tests weren't testing we're testing only the API and weren't testing that the endpoints were valid. And the person wanting to do it, but it was too complex, so I added a new task.
So we can close this now?
Yeah, close it. If he didn't follow up, doesn't matter.
Great. Service VIP cluster application error, container D, local endpoint not found. This sounds like Node.
Yeah.
With Windows. Okay, there's a whole lot of numbers in here, but I'm not
It's
sure what the bug
Windows.
is.
Whoever owns Windows proxy.
James Sturdivant added it to the backlog in SIG Windows last week. I'm not sure.
Just assign it to DA shot.
To who?
It's one comment above, DASHOTT.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that's it. Double check.
Scott shot. Yep.
Two T's. Yeah, there you go.
Wait for time, a few more minutes. Server logs flooded with skipping invalid IP. Skipping invalid IP, and it looks like there's nothing else, so it's probably an empty string somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. This should be accepted.
Do we know what it really is, or like, is there a place where we should be filtering out empty strings?
It's, if you see at the top, it's load balancer, like host name versus IP. And so we're probably just missing a, if IP equals empty, then don't do the thing. Anybody want to take this? This might be an easy one for.
I was just going to say,
new
I was going to put it on help wanted or
Yep.
good first issue.
Yeah, for sure.
There is someone already assigned that asked you if they can help on the bottom. Feng
Delete.
Yeah.
Well, they're asking for help triaging it.
What's the PR there though?
Oh, you can't see that. Sorry. Put it back over here somewhere. Yep, there it is.
That's legit. All right. We should LGTM this if it isn't already, but there were a whole bunch of flags, right? I thought it already had some. Maybe not. Yeah, Minhan like LGTM'd it.
Okay.
3 days ago.
Do not merge needs SIG. What?
How did that not get auto sigged?
I mean, there is a SIG.
Yeah.
Thanks, bot.
I think maybe because it was needs triage and nobody had accepted it, maybe.
That's a fun one. Should we suggest a backport?
Yeah.
Oh. This new keyboard, I'm still learning it. All right, where did we go? Is this closed now?
Time check, Tim. Do we want to stop
Okay.
now or go for 5 more minutes? We don't have a very large agenda, but KEP review might take a while.
Yeah, I would be happy to have time to spend on caps.
All right, let's do that then.
Let's stop here. There's more open as usual. Feel free to go through and take a look at these. I'll try to look at them again later and do some assignees. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, Google. 20% volume.
Sorry, I got to pull up the agenda doc again. For some reason, I closed that. But I think we're on to KEP review, right? Or anything anybody wants to bring up. Somebody want to share the spreadsheet? Do you want to do that, Tim, since you're already sharing?
Sure. All right, so here's the sheet. There's not that many when you scroll through. Here's most of our network ones. I think there's a few others. Yeah, there's a few more down. So we have endpoint slice, API. What are we doing? Are we looking for questions or?
I mean, I guess I'd like to know, what do people need to concentrate on for the next, 6 hours or whatever it is.
I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 caps, 6 PRs that I am tracking at the moment for hopefully for today. One is storage, one is node, 2 are storage, 1, 2, 3 are network.
Are there?
I guess my question is, are there more? Am I missing some?
Does anybody on the call want to raise their KEP?
In 15 minutes.
I don't, but I would like to ask you to take a look later into the performance review from Volstack, because they are asking us for maybe to GA have a status into network policy.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess it's something that we should discuss better. I know there is that then winship cap as well, but I don't think it's that easy, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly talked about it before. We've sort of danced around it and not done anything there, but it doesn't seem out of bounds to ask and to talk about it. So I see that you're merged. That's good. Andrew, I think, has the 2 that I'm otherwise tracking, which has some of the more interesting comments. Andrew, do you want to talk about those?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll start with the one with the least amount of comments, which is this one around implementing service internal traffic policy. I think Wojciech was asking if we should have metrics that expose when there are no local endpoints and traffic is being blackholed. How do we surface that to operators? And I think, Tim, you're suggesting we only make metrics if there's no local endpoints and internal traffic policy is local. Otherwise, we just ignore it.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to figure out, like, what question would I want to ask in order to know whether the internal traffic policy is working, right? And the answer that I came to was, well, I guess I'd want to know if there's something with internal traffic policy turned on and it was going nowhere, like the feature wasn't actually assigning endpoints to it, right? So that's why I suggested the black holes. I mean, it's a terrible name, but you get the idea, as a possible metric, because it's also not particularly complicated to implement.
Yeah, I think the. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think
I was just gonna say the other one, CSMA CD. The alternatives were much more complicated to implement. That one seemed like a very tangible one.
Yeah, I think the tricky part is that traffic being black hole is a desired state in some cases, right? So like, but
Yeah.
I get your point that like we don't necessarily have to learn on it. We're just creating a metric, and folks can do whatever they want with it.
Right. I mean, the PRR question is, if you were rolling this out, what might you look at to figure out if it was not working, right? If I didn't expect it to be black holing stuff and it was, then that would be nice to know.
Sure. And you're saying for external traffic policy, because that's more common, you don't think we need to add a metric there?
Well, I mean, at least the way I've used external traffic policy, many of the nodes are black hole on purpose, or not on purpose, but because there aren't as many replicas as there are nodes, right? Like I might have one replica of a service that I'm exposing externally, and in my 100 node cluster, 99 of those nodes don't have a local copy of it, and that's okay. That's not a problem. And we have all the health check stuff, the health check node port stuff to make that okay. But if I'm setting something for internal traffic policy, it seems like the main use case for that is the per node service, right? I mean, that was the motivating use case.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Okay, I'll add that in the cap.
But we can report services and local endpoints and non-local endpoints, like a count.
Sure, we can return a count of services, and we can return a count of endpoints, but those are like sums across all of the services. We can't report. Go ahead.
The metric is the services is the label. I don't know what is the name in Prometheus. The label, and that has it's like a map, no? And you have ready, so you can know how many endpoints local, how many local endpoints has a service.
But you don't want to put, in general, you don't want to put non-constant data in metric labels, because you end up with huge cardinality, which is really hard to deal with.
Yeah, but when you aggregate all the labels, you have all the local endpoints in the queue proxy. I mean, the label is the discriminator.
But you're saying put the service name in there?
Right.
Yeah, then you end up with a very high cardinality metric that is very hard to scrape. So they, like, in general, like, at least what I've read, I'm super not an expert on Prometheus metrics. What I've read is they want you to aggregate into something, you know, of a finite cardinality. So slicing it up based on, you know, which traffic policy or, you know, something else is reasonable. But because we know that there will be services that have one endpoint and there'll be services that have 100 endpoints in the same cluster, the total isn't super useful. In one of these threads here, I suggested going further. Where is it? Maybe it was in the other PR. Yeah, I suggested going further and like actually logging, you know, fixed percentiles of stuff, but that's a lot more work to think about. Maybe there's a better way to express this in Prometheus, but this is how I would think about it. If I wanted to know, like, how many services have terminating endpoints and how many terminating endpoints, I'd say, like, what's the 99th percentile number of terminating endpoints per service, right? I don't know how to express that in Prometheus. It's a distribution of distributions.
Yeah, it sounds like there should be like an entirely different cap on just queue proxy metrics.
Yeah, yes, I think that would be a really fun project to really just think about what questions are we not able to answer today that we should add metrics for. But to appease the PRR gods, let's figure out what we can do in the relatively short, what we can commit to in the short term, right? So I think committing to number of black holes is a pretty reasonable start.
Yeah, sure.
And Antonio, I liked your other, or was your idea? Yeah, I think it was your idea up above about slicing the desired endpoints on the controller. Though I guess that the summation problem needs to be dealt with, but that seems like a reasonable, yeah, it was you, reasonable step also.
Cool. And then so for the terminating and graceful handling with kproxy, I think the other major blocker was testability and how we're going to automate that, because it requires you to do a rolling update of the pod with the cloud load balancer, and then you have to time the way the health check node port lines up with when the endpoint count goes to 0, and so there's a whole possibility that the test will be completely flaky and not a good signal. I don't really have a good answer for that. I think we're going to do our best to write the test, but I think the flakiness is going to be hard to control on this one, I think.
Well, it's all right. We've always got Antonio to fix them for us.
Yep.
He doesn't seem to think that was funny.
Yeah, that's. But we have, what is the name? Sweat? No, the one that deflated the load balancer once. It wasn't me. It was.
Is there any way to take the cloud load balancer out of the equation?
That's the thing that I have. I was working the other day on my weekend. I have a mock for the load balancer, and I'm the only problem that they have now is to fake the traffic to emulate that is coming from outside, because the load balancer knows if it's internal or it's external. So the mocking the load balancer is easy. It's just patching the service and all the stuff with the status. But what is not easy is to fake the external traffic.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be too hard to fake external traffic, but like you're right, all the status around it might be a problem.
I mean really fake, not sending traffic from the E2E binary. That's the main source of flakiness. If you
right, I meant more like we can't send it from the EDE binary itself, right? But can we start a pod in the cluster that could emulate? I mean, send traffic to a node port or somehow otherwise look like it's coming from outside the cluster.
Yeah, that's the thing that I have. I have implemented that, but it's very tricky. You need to overlap IP tables.
I mean, the fact that we're even discussing sending fake packets over pod makes me think that it's going to be really hard to test the thing. So yeah, I think, yeah, it'll be hard.
Okay.
It's a total hack. But I mean, there are some load balancing tests working in GCE. I think that we can make it.
So, Andrew, do you think that you'll be able to make the updates and we'll be able to get closure on this by the end of today?
So I can update the CAP right after this meeting, but I think it's on Tim. If Tim can follow up quickly and approve, then I'm good.
Okay, ping me as soon as it's ready.
Okay.
So those are the two that I'm tracking right now. Does anybody here have a PR that is not one of those two? Anybody who's not Andrew, do you have a PR that you need me to look at today? Okay, that's not so bad.
Yeah.
I wish the other SIGs were together.
All right, anything else for KEP review? Going once, going twice. All right. Next up is cluster network policy update. Who is going to drive that?
Hi, Sanjeev and I can collectively drive that. I don't know if I got permission to share my screen.
Yep, permission should be on. If it doesn't work, let me know.
All right, so can everybody see my screen right now?
Yep, looking good.
Cool, sounds good. So I'll go ahead and update you guys on the current status on the cluster network policy. We receive a bunch of comments on the CAP, and there are some key battlefields, or I would say points where people are not agree upon. So I wanted to sort of like list it out here and see if we can sort of get somewhat a consensus as a group in SIG network, so that we can basically push this CAP forward. Essentially, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to sort of like separate the use cases in the cluster network policy from the CAP to separate user story folder in the new network policy GitHub repo that we created. For these user stories, we sort of like wanted to have some approval or some reviews, and then we can agree on this is user stories that we definitely want to solve. And on the CAP itself, we can basically just focus on the CRD design to solve these use cases. That's a move that we're trying to do now. So some of the key points we listed here is that we wanted to have some more feedback. First of all, do we actually need a cluster default network policy? And this is something that we started out by wanting to have a default security posture for some of the workloads, but they can completely be overridden by namespace scope network policies. And on the CAP, we are seeing sort of like contradicting comments where some people think it's beneficial to have this sort of like default policy, and the others think that, for example, on the cases like namespace isolation, etc., they should be enforced rather than giving the network namespace users the ability to write their own network policies to sort of like override these. So this is the one field that we're trying to still get some more feedback on. And the other thing is for the cluster network policy action, we listed a separate slide here, is that is a explicit deny needed, first of all. And I think the group as all somehow agrees that we cannot use a pure allow list model like the network policy does. So in some circumstances, it is useful to enforce enterprise security compliance. So we needed a explicit deny for cluster network policy. So we can explicitly say, hey, this from this to this should be denied. But the question is, if we have a explicit deny and explicit allow, at least these two actions, it doesn't make sense to have one action type always have precedence over the other, or we should basically just do the sequence numbered priority model so that it's more flexible. And if the complexity of the sequence numbering is worsened. We listed two very basic examples here to sort of like illustrate this problem. Because right now we're thinking, okay, we can do something like network policy, right? Where the allow action will always have higher precedence than the deny action, for example. Now think about this scenario where we wanted to basically, for a certain set of pods, we want to drop traffic received from S1 and S2. And at the same time, we want to accept only HTTPS traffic. Now, if we have some sort of like precedence, non-determined precedence or priority numbers, we can always write two different rules for this. And one is basically deny non-HTTPS traffic at the bottom, and then deny allow HTTPS traffic at the bottom and deny these two at the top. So that when we stack those two policies, it will give us this semantics that we want. But if allow is always have a higher priority, this becomes very tough to write, because now you need to write the rule as allow from everywhere except S1 and S2. And this is a very hard selection to make based on the current selectors and mechanisms. So it's essentially the point is, without explicit priority numbers, we needed a very strong or powerful way to do selections in any combinations, like from certain namespaces, except of certain sources and that kind of stuff. That way we can get around not having a allow that is always being higher precedence than the deny, or vice versa. But does everybody think that's a good idea, or we should essentially go with some sort of like priority number based approach for the precedence of actions?
Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I think you should have better user stories and use cases so that we can look at the user stories and use cases and see whether they require explicit priority numbers or not.
Agreed. And I think like when we're putting these, when we're having the conversation of the user stories, like this will, all the implementation details will fall out, right, in the discussion of each one.
Yeah, I think so those two are essentially the use cases where we come up in terms of thinking about the sort of like the corner cases for the priorities, right? So if you think about things like very common use cases like namespace isolation, for example, that could become fairly straightforward because it's a determined use case, and you know, we can always come up with even keywords like self namespace or not self namespaces to make the selections that we intended. Now, these two we listed here, those are actually by Sanjeev, who is also on the call, I believe. He was listing those out as corner cases, which I believe is also a possible scenario where cluster cluster admins wants to enforce these, but they will be very hard to express using a cluster network policy spec that has very explicit priorities precedence, like one action over the other.
So just to add, we are doing use cases in two kinds of ways. One is, specific examples like this one, and then the next slide, we've got the standard categories, which seem to be some of the common use cases for cluster network policy, right? So one is, and we invite your thoughts on this. So one is having good cluster egress filtering, right? And in a way that the cluster admin can enforce security, which namespace scope policies cannot bypass, because you don't want pods connecting to, you want to limit how pods can connect outside. The other one is cluster ingress filtering, which has two aspects. One is ingress to the cluster as well as ingress within the cluster. Now, we'll come back to that because there's the issue of the source IP thing over there. The next is namespace isolation. And here, what we're saying is, it appears, at least both from the comments on the KEP as well as our experience, that it's pretty frequent that a cluster admin wants to enforce some kind of tenancy using a group of namespaces with the selective ability to connect to services namespaces. So that's that use case. And then the explicit deny option we just talked about. And then finally, just better solutions for exceptions. The current IP block exception is sort of kind of strange. So what we're doing with use cases is one is these kinds of categories, and one is specific examples like the previous slide, where, and if you go back to that, there's some rationale for those use cases as well. If you go back, yeah, so here this one is saying, okay, you've got malicious sources S1 and S2, and also you only want to accept HTTPS. So that's appears to be a fairly reasonable sort of requirement. The second one is, you don't want UDP or ISLP or whatever, except when received from your special sources S3, S4, because those might be the cluster admins special probing sources, and he wants to allow those traffic from those sources, but not from the rest of the internet. So bottom line is that we think these are rational use cases. We want to use these to close sufficient amount of KEP to move forward. We think maybe we can differ on some of the slightly controversial features, like whether the default network policy and so on. And that way we can, our whole goal here is to get this cluster network policy into V1 Alpha 1. And then we will always have the opportunity to add changes into V1 Alpha 2. But Yang and team have been working on it. I kind of just recently got in, so I was just trying to help move this along. And my thought was that let's try to close the mandatory set for V1 Alpha 1, and then we can continue on the other cases which can bring in into either V1 Alpha 2 or maybe in a future release. There's several things here, but maybe we'll take a pause here and get. The question for the team is, would the team be open to saying that there is reasonable consensus of a common set of cluster network policy controls, as mentioned in the next slide. And let's go ahead and start with a CRD for some or all of these use cases. And then we can, as we are sort of pipelining that implementation, if somebody wants to make changes for V1 Alpha 2, we can do that. Otherwise, we'd be going in circles for the last 7-8 months, and we want to kind of move this forward. Okay, that was a mouthful, but hopefully conveys the point. So question is the community okay with either finding sort of a baseline set for V1 Alpha 1 for cluster network policy and then moving on that, and then additional features which are sort of on the fence can be either V1 Alpha 2 or the debate can continue, so that this feature which has been sitting on the sidelines for almost a year gets to move forward.
I think that seems reasonable. The default network policy is additive. We can really split on those. So that's a good insight, I think. The question, I mean, there's some fundamental schematic questions here, right? Like, is it numerical stacking, or is it what was, at least the last I looked at it, it was pretty simply defined as allow, deny, allow, right?
Yeah, so our current thinking is that sort of allow, deny, allow, or authorize, deny, allow is somewhat hokey. And
yes,
a lot of people are anyway used to priority sequence numbers, so we might as well bite that bullet. And that way we'll not have any caveats, because once you have the priority sequence numbers, you can do all these exception scenarios. So otherwise we'd be sort of dancing around the issue with all these other alternatives.
So I was hoping, oh, did you have more, Tim?
No, I was gonna say it sounded like somebody was talking, but I couldn't tell who it was and they cut out for a second.
Oh yeah, my network is bad. I might be cutting out. So I want to object to the idea of let's rush out Alpha 1 and then we can add to it later. Like, this is how we got network policy how it is, by like just throwing in every feature that somebody wanted and not really thinking about how it all fits together. And I think it would be much better to come up with a coherent idea of what we are trying to do and then come up with a good API for doing that, rather than taking every feature request anybody has had and coming up with an API that can accommodate all those things, but is kind of sprawling and.
Agreed. So do these use cases make sense as the target set for an initial? I mean, there's obviously second level of detail here.
I look at it two ways personally. If you want something quick or quicker, right, you would just take network policy as is and change the scope, right? When we start adding use cases, like, we have to start thinking and talking about maybe making a new version of APIs. I think that's like something that was confusing people with the initial KEP was, what set of APIs is this designed for? The existing set, how network policy works now, or a new set of APIs?
So Andrew, one thing that we've seen, so that makes sense, but it'll be slightly incomplete. If you go to the previous slide, Yang. Actually, one more, 3. So at a minimum, we feel that we will need an explicit deny, because the whole purpose of a cluster network policy is drop packets that are compromising the cluster and not have any way for the namespace policy to override that. If we do not have explicit deny, if we just have an allow model, if the cluster network policy is just today's network policy at a cluster scope, there is no explicit deny, which means you have a set of allows at the cluster level, but you're not denying your the policy that the cluster network policy administrator wants to keep out, and the namespace can just open up and let that come in. So the key point is that cluster network policy has to, one of the main goals is to enforce cluster security, and at a minimum, explicit deny is needed. Once you have explicit deny, then you have, okay, what's the relative priority between explicit deny and explicit allow, and do we want the sequence numbers? So that starts defining your minimum set, which is explicit deny, explicit allow, possibly with priority numbers. So you can't just use the current network policy because you wouldn't be able to deny, and the cluster admin wouldn't be able to limit the cluster from receiving malicious traffic.
So silly question, and I don't think it should work this way, but what if when you created a cluster network policy, it did the default deny for everything in the cluster that overrode network policies? And then you punch holes through that.
Yeah, that was my question as well.
So
I don't think I followed that.
Yeah. Why would
well, so if we don't have an explicit deny, we don't have one in network policy either. But what we do have for network policy is when you create a network policy that applies to anything, we have the default deny. And so until you punch holes through something, everything is denied by default.
But that doesn't work for the reasons they talk about on the next slide. Like you can't compose, like, don't allow people to talk to X and don't allow people to talk to Y if you don't have explicit deny.
And I don't think it solves one of the use cases that I've heard the most, which is, I know you think you want to go to 1.2.3.4, but I'm saying you can't. And the administrator needs a way to put a bounding box around what the users can do. Now, I'm just saying this out loud, but I don't think it's the right way to go either. You could say that everything that's allowed at the cluster level is the bounding box. It's not actually allowing them, but it's like, that's the box and you can't go outside the box. And then you don't need an explicit deny because everything that's not, let's call it empowered. Anything that's not empowered is denied. But then that doesn't provide for explicit allow semantics, right? The like always let the monitoring system through. One of the main reasons a long time back that I suggested that we pursue this as a different API was because I feel like the semantics are different, and the persona that's interacting with it has a higher capacity for complexity. It's the cluster admin, not the app owner, and so it's okay for this API to be moderately more complicated.
Would it be fair to say that with cluster network policy, it is more likely that you will allow things and deny only specific things, as opposed to network policy where it's much more focused and likely a smaller set of things that you're talking about? And so therefore it'd be acceptable to have the app admin punch holes through.
Our thought was that it's more likely for cluster network policies to be denying because it's tracking, malicious sources and things like that. So, and also limiting, for example, egress traffic only goes through Docker Hub and nowhere else, or only from this namespace and things like that.
Those are the primary use cases that I've heard for this sort of guardrails approach. I like the tenant ability. I think that's a really interesting use case that I have definitely heard come up over and over again. I'm torn.
Go to the next slide, please, really quick.
Yep.
Sorry, go ahead, Tim.
I'm torn on the allow, deny, allow versus arbitrary levels. On the one hand, I find the fixed 3 level to be very expressive. You can express a whole lot of things in that pattern, especially if we generalize the exception condition. On the other hand, like the industry at large sort of understands the leveled rules, and so maybe we shouldn't swim upstream against that.
Right. Yeah. Our thought was that it is a little bit more complexity, but most cluster admins are probably used to sequence numbers, as opposed to app developers, which are more likely to do whitelist models?
I think it's more than a little bit more complexity, though. I think it's actually fairly significant because we don't have one list, right? You can create any number of resources, and in order to understand the effect of a new change, you have to understand all of the other ones, right? Like where you insert it into the list there's no one list, right? Unless we mandate it, I guess. We could require the API, but we don't have a concept of like a singleton in Kubernetes. So if I can create one of these, I can create N of them.
Yeah, so I guess that's why the other ideas we had is some sort of like tiers or buckets or enums for the priorities, so that we have a definite set of priorities which can be allow and deny, but we don't give the user ability to specify any sort of like sequence numbers that we want basically. But still, that's sort of like a compromising between, I guess.
Yeah. This is not intractable, right? Like this can be solved with tooling, right? kubectl describe cluster network policies could pull them all together and show you the converged list, or some other tooling, right? I'm just saying that you can't take a myopic view of a single resource and understand what that resource is going to do, which, by the way, is the same thing that several people have accused ingress of having a problem with, right? You can't look at a single ingress, especially with like the Nginx ingress, and understand what it's going to do to the system.
A quick time check, by the way, we do have one more item on the agenda.
One quick note before we stop. So we would invite feedback. What we were hoping was, we definitely don't want to rush V1 Alpha 1, but we think there is a reasonable set for V1 Alpha 1. And given that this KEP has been sort of under discussion for close to a year, we would love for ideas on getting to V1 Alpha 1. One last thing about the sequence numbers, different teams, because the cluster network policy is by the cluster team, the cluster admins typically are not operating independent of each other, as opposed to developers, which are developing services independent of each other. So giving developers priority sequences can cause them to overwrite each other or bypass each other. But a cluster admin typically has a unified view across the cluster admin team.
Anyway, so that's the sort of thing that ought to be in the user stories or use cases. Like, as we have designed this under the assumption that the cluster admins who are using this API are working in concert, and so we don't have to worry about coordination problems between them. Like that's the kind of thing that affects what is a good or a bad solution.
Sure.
So the last I looked at the KEP, it was still the allow, deny, allow model. I look at it now, I see there's been some responses to my comments. If you guys, as the authors of the KEP, are proposing that we switch to a priority level model, is the KEP updated, or when will it be?
So I think the reason we're saying here in this SIG network meeting is we wanted to get some feedback on, do you guys think priority model is the way to go, or should we just not do the priority model and just do allow and deny 2 actions period, and we can figure out selecting workloads by using some more so sophisticated selection mechanisms as opposed to overloading the priorities.
So given these use cases, it would be interesting to see what sorts of things we cannot express with the allow, deny, allow model, or allow, whatever you're calling it, authorize, deny, allow, and that would be expressible in the more general model, and whether those matter. Like, these seem like they're expressible in the allow, deny, allow model, right? So deny all traffic from S1 and S2. Like,
we should discuss this, because there was also a comment that certain people expressed that having strange word keywords like authorize are not intuitive, and it seems a little hacky.
Oh, I agree with that. I think that might have been my comment, but that's just words. We can find the right words.
Okay, so should we'll invite your suggestions on how we can move the KEP forward to some level of
I guess
yeah.
My default position is simple, unless you can show me why simple doesn't work. And honestly, I'm willing to give a lot of weight to people already understand this model, and we shouldn't go against it. Look, this is what Cisco does, and this is what, blah, blah, blah. If that's the case, then, maybe that alone is enough to carry the message.
So all ACL implementations, whether they are physical switches or as, in AWS or all of the public clouds, they all have sequence number based ACLs. So it is not an uncommon pattern. In fact, it is the most common pattern. But you're absolutely right that we should be very sure before we add complexity. But so point taken.
Okay.
But if you feel like that's the case, my point, I guess, is I would say take the existing design, move it into one of the alternatives considered, and write the new design in the cap, right? Or even flip it around, leave it the way it is, write this in the alternatives considered, and then say, we're proposing to flip these two around, like object now.
Okay. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And we're going to move Antonio's item for host network pods to the next meeting. And Bridget, you wanted to highlight the preferred dual stack fixed loop PR and issue.
Yes, I know that finding anything in your GitHub notifications when you have all of the GitHub notifications is challenging. But since Dan and Tim and Antonio were the exact people that Cal was hoping could look at this, I put a link in the notes and I also just put it in the chat. And basically, we don't need to discuss it at length on this meeting, but this is the trying to fix the preferred dual stack loop issue. And it doesn't look simple. So Cal is looking for folks to possibly weigh in on that comment.
I was talking with Cal 2 hours ago. So basically, moving from single to dual is okay. Moving from dual to single is complicated. He explained it in the last comment that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's simple if you're going from the preferred address family in a dual stack to only that address family in single stack, right? Because then you don't have to touch cluster IP. But the problem is if you're going from the dual stack to the non-preferred address family in single stack, that seems not possible with our current restrictions around cluster IP.
Yeah.
My initial impression there was that just seems silly. I don't know. Are people really going to downgrade from dual stack?
I don't know. I mean, I had the same thought of like, hey, there's a way that you can go from V4 to V6 by going through dual stack and then back down. But we've also said so far, like the first entry in that list may not change. So in order for us to allow that, we would have to allow cluster IP to change, right? Which, maybe we want to do. Maybe it's not such an egregious deal as we thought about before, but we should be really careful if we open that can of worms.
I have another concern, and is that we are in a repair loop of the snapshot, and we send a patch that is going to take another version of that snapshot to modify IPs. So the repair loop grabs the snapshot, checks if it needs to do something, and send a patch to the service that needs to be upgraded. So this has to go through all the rest, and it has to touch the allocator there.
Right.
And I don't know if that is going to work, or it's going to be racy, or it's going to have some kind of problem. Because you are going to operate in a snapshot that is older than the one. So you grab an old version, and when you send the patch, the snapshot is going to be newer than the one that you are modifying, or not?
I'll have to go look at it. I mean, naively, why are we touching the snapshot at all here? We should just be able to loop over all services, right?
Yeah, but it's what you do. You loop over services. I mean, if you don't modify it, okay.
Well, I haven't looked at the PR, so maybe we're in the loop over the existing snapshot, but like, could we instead say like, it's just a separate loop and all it does is for each service, if the flags don't match the service, then make some changes and move on.
Maybe I'm overthinking it. Okay, correct.
Or maybe I'm underthinking it. I'll have to take a look. Cal pinged me today too. I promised that I would take a look as soon as CapHell ended.
Yeah.
All right, that's all I wanted. Thank you.
All right. And we are out of agenda and we are out of time. So thank
Awesome.
you, everybody, and see you in 2 weeks and go review some caps.
Thanks, everyone. Don't forget your KubeCon North America CFP closes in like a week or something. So week and a half, something like that. So get your proposals in. Antonio, I can see a proposal on IP allocation coming.
A master degree.
3 people would go to that.
Okay.
I think you'd be surprised. Fair
enough.
All right. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody. Bye.
So, folks.